Welcome to the world's greatest podcast, named The Mentionables. The Mentionables! I'm Joel Furches.
I'm Nick Peters, and I affirm a virgin birth.
Virgin birth. Virgin birth.
I'm Clinton Wilcox.
And I'm Tyler Vela.
Today on The Mentionables, turns out everyone is an atheist. It's just a numbers game. Also, why is it that you do good, moral, and right things, assuming you do? Is it out of fear? Think about that now. We're joined for a third time by everyone's favorite bioethicist, Clinton Wilcox. Clinton, you've got a segment for us today, that right?
I do. It's not bioethics related, but I do have a segment that I brought in based on a conversation I'd had on social media recently with an atheist.
Is there any chance I would know this atheist?
You know, I'm not sure. I don't recall what his name was. I'm trying to remember. It was either on the Unbelievable group, or it might have been on a group called Reason and Religion.
I don't belong to that one. Oh, well.
Yeah.
How about this? I'll do my segment, and you close us out.
Okay, that'll work.
All right. So today I want to deal with a claim you'll see, often in meme format, that essentially says that Christians only act morally because we are afraid of hell and we want to go to heaven. Essentially, we're acting out of this sort of karmic ideal that good works lay up reward in heaven, whereas bad works tip the balance in the direction of hell. Presumably, if our bad works eventually outnumbered our good works, we'd land ourselves in a big old lake of fire. Meanwhile, atheists act morally because they want to do good. They don't get any kind of karmic reward out of doing good. They act out of a sort of selfless empathy toward others. Have you fellows ever run into this assertion by atheists?
Oh, yes. No, never, ever. Where are you meeting these guys?
Definitely out on social media.
That objection.
All right.
I've never heard it today.
All right, well, let's lay it out. So the first claim we want to examine, of course, is what is the ultimate motivation for atheist morality? Notice here I'm not talking about grounding or knowledge. The claim we're examining is that Christians are motivated to refrain from doing evil out of fear and to do good out of desire for reward. How Christians and atheists determine what is good and how they ground the good are different questions. So, for instance, a Christian and an atheist might agree that giving charitably is a good thing. How do they come to that knowledge? Maybe someone told them. Maybe they experienced a sense of empathy for the poor person. Maybe it was some kind of inner knowledge. The question we're looking at is not how they know it's a good thing to do. The question is, knowing it's a good thing to do, why do they then do it? The mean would suggest that an atheist does it because it's the right thing to do, because they're good people, unlike those Christians who are acting out of a sort of karmic motivation to accrue points for the afterlife. Atheists will generally say that they experience an inner sense of empathy. They see the individual suffering, they experience empathy, and then they act on that empathy in order to alleviate the burden, pain, discomfort, or needs of the other person.
Yeah, it seems to me, though, that if their main reason for doing good is that sense of empathy, then it seems like it really is a selfish motivation, because if you act out of empathy, that makes you feel good. And so if you are doing good because it makes you feel good, then it seems like that's kind of a selfish motivation, too.
Yeah, it's a solid point. I mean, from the atheist perspective, we're just biological machines, no different than animals. So all of our motivations are out of sort of a pain-pleasure operation, a punishment-reward type operation. So, I mean, following the atheist perspective, assuming that they do have that perspective, the naturalistic perspective, then there's no way that we would act unless we were motivated by the basic reward-punishment kind of drive.
If I could throw in something as well, I really don't think any one of us, no matter what position, ever does anything of purely, entirely altruistic motives. There's always something we want because we are built to desire the good, and that's not a bad thing. Always. I can go in, if I want something to eat, go fix myself a meal. And, you could say, you did that for yourself. Yeah, I did. What of it? You have to. So I think it's just false to say anyone does things just for purely altruistic motives. There's some good that we think is worthwhile that we're pursuing.
Yeah. No, honestly, when you think that the good is the right thing to do, then your motivation shifts towards the good because you desire the good. This is a desire you have, and you're fulfilling this desire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's also something interesting. This is actually what the book of Job is really about. A lot of people get this idea about, if you're trying to understand why there is suffering and evil in the world, you should read the book of Job. Okay? You can read the book of Job, but you're never going to get an answer to that question. That's not what it's about. The question that the book is about is the very one that the adversary asks at the beginning of the book to God. Does Job fear God for nothing? In other words, the challenge is, well, of course Job serves you. I mean, you give him everything you want. If you took that away, will he still keep serving you? And that's the question that is really being answered in the book is, do you serve God for what he does for you, or do you serve him because he's God?
Right. Yeah, I think that's the obvious conclusion. Now, it's a big book because they have a lot of conversations about the ultimate nature of justice and about all of the problems they see in the world, and I love that. It's the conversation we've all had, and the fact that it's acknowledged in possibly the first book ever written is, it's a very human thing, and I like that. But I could talk all day about Job. All right, so the meme we're talking about, it goes on to suggest that Christians do good because they're afraid of hell and they desire heaven. So ultimately the criticism is that atheists act selflessly out of concern for the person, whereas Christians act selfishly out of the concern for themselves. Now, off the bat, there's a flaw to this reasoning. Let's define empathy. Actually, this is what Clinton already brought up. He says that, empathy is this feeling what the other person feels, essentially. So I drive past some poor homeless guy who's wrapped up in cardboard and clearly suffering in the heat or cold, depending on the weather, and I look at him and I empathize with him, which means that I kind of mentally suffer along with him. It makes me uncomfortable to see him in this position. So that when I act on that empathy and I try to help him, that makes me feel more comfortable. So ultimately, what have I done? I've relieved my own discomfort in acting. And that was the point you made, right?
Yeah. Yeah, essentially that was the point I was making.
Yeah. So presumably if a psychopath acted to relieve the suffering of another person, he'd be doing it selflessly because he doesn't have a sense of empathy at all. Now, in order to avoid straw-manning the atheist position, I asked our very good friend, Clinton, whose name I won't mention, but I believe he may have been the atheist you were referencing.
It could be.
Well, you and I share an atheist friend that we spend a lot of time sparring with on Facebook, so I think you know who I'm talking about.
Oh, okay. No, if that's the guy you're thinking of, no, he's not. Oh, but actually, now that you bring that up, though, I actually think it was on one of his Facebook statuses. So I don't think it was in the group at all. I actually think it was on one of his statuses. Now that you mention.
Yeah, I remember you having that conversation on his status, so I didn't know if that was what brought it to mind. At any rate, for our listeners, the gentleman that we're talking about and mentionable Mark Lambert did a debate, which will be airing on our premium podcast for our patrons. So if you want to know more about the guy that we're talking about, he'll be featured on an episode that we do on the premium podcast in a debate between he and Mark. If anyone is interested in hearing what this guy has to offer, go ahead and subscribe and you'll hear it soon. Anyway, he tells us this, quote, I have an urge to see me and my people survive and thrive. I assume that goal comes from evolution. With that as my goal, it becomes a question of which strategies to employ to best realize my goal. I can rationally justify adherence to things like the Golden Rule in order to realize my goal. So what he's essentially saying is that through the process of evolution, we have developed a survival instinct because it's adaptive to do so. And then we've generalized the survival instinct to a wider tribe of family, friends, neighbors, countrymen, etc. Again, because humans that do this are more prone to preserve their particular DNA because there is a broader buttress of preservation in the collective than in the individual. So good behavior is evolutionarily adaptive, and we have the urge to do good as a result. All right, what thoughts do you guys have on that explanation?
I was going to bring up this before, where it's somewhat interesting to say that the atheistic position is intrinsically altruistic, while the Christian position is intrinsically selfish. I mean, for lots of reasons. They can't ground the objective moral values. They can't ground the objective moral duties. I mean, there's all kinds of other problems. But at the end of the day, you have their system, which is intrinsically about self-preservation. I mean, this is why Dawkins called his book The Selfish Gene. That some action is not in itself good, except insofar as it lends itself to evolutionary advantage. And so really at the end of the day, they're saying we're the most selfless when we're being the most selfish, which just, to me, seems like a ridiculous position to try to hold.
Yeah, I would agree.
I think it's also that if we say we're doing all this because we want to preserve our genes, many of us aren't really thinking that way. I would wager very, very, very few people think that way. Simple example, I go to a post office, look and see if I got any books. I'm hanging out, and here comes this little old lady wanting to go in. I hold the door open for her. I can assure you my mind is nothing. Gosh, this is really going to help me pass on my genes before too long.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like more of a grounding than it is the motivation. Mm-hmm. All right, well, in order to get a more robust response, I also asked our old atheist buddy Ben Watkins, who listeners might remember debating Tyler at our first Mentionables conference, why he thought atheists were motivated to do good. He's actually a studying philosopher as well as an atheist, so I thought he would be a good person to ask. And he had an insightful comment that went into the realm of psychology and sociology. So I'll quote him here. He says, quote, both atheists and theists are motivated by 5 things, generally. Number 1, status. Number 2, the feelings of certainty. Number 3, freedom. Number 4, relationships and security. And number 5, fairness. Each of these general motivations has a moral component. For example, both theists and atheists are morally motivated to act in ways which promote fairness in transactions as an end in itself. People may disagree on all sides as to how fairness should be cashed out in moral terms, but all parties to the discussion can agree that fairness is a moral virtue in itself, which we are generally predisposed. Standing engagements between atheists and theists as to who has committed more atrocities in history. It's a war about moral status. Each side wants the moral high ground, so that motivates both sides to give at least the appearance of conformance to moral norms. There is no empathy view. That's a mistake among atheists. It is a separate from ethics. Putting forward a psychological explanation for an ethical fact commits the naturalistic fallacy. Almost finished the quote, okay? I agree our well-being consists in facts about well-being. We all have reasons to care about our well-being and that of others. However, I strongly resist any attempt to reduce ethical facts to facts about human flourishing. So here he's kind of disagreeing with the other atheist. The ethical claim that pain is bad is very different from the biological claim that our well-being consists in certain facts about our flourishing. All right, I'll unpack that a bit. Ben lists 5 different motivations for doing moral good. He says status, the feeling of certainty, relationships and security, and fairness. I like to note that, with the exception of fairness, all of these are generally selfish motivations. I want to be good because it increases my status. This is generally a psychological motivation. If doing evil elevated my status, I'd do that instead. Consider the school bully. He runs with a bad crowd, so when he is seen beating up some dweeb, his friends are impressed, the rest of the dweebs are more fearful of him, and his status is increased. And we see this in societies throughout history. Often it is the roughest and most violent of the bunch who is seen as the alpha and given a higher status. Honestly, it's really only against the backdrop of Western Judeo-Christian values where doing good for other people accords you higher status. And as an example of that, we could look at sort of the political nature of the West nowadays. I mean, there's this sort of honor-shame view where if you or your ancestors did anything that might be considered harmful to a minority, then you occupy this sort of moral status of shame, and therefore, you have the moral low ground. And by the mere fact of being a victim, you have the moral high ground. Now, that wouldn't fly classically in your older cultures. The only reason that works in this culture is because we have this idea that, the underdog ought to be appreciated over the oppressor. So whereas in an older culture, it's the glorious victor who rises above everyone else that has received the honor, in the Western culture with a Judeo-Christian background, it's the underdog that receives the honor. That's sort of your realm, Nick. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was thinking a whole lot about this kind of thing. Thinking that I don't think this whole situation would work well in a culture that was not individualistic. And I guess you want to kind of align yourselves with the people who have the status so you can get the status from them. And this can relate to, about someone's happiness. And Aristotle, for instance, believed that your happiness could be altered after you were dead. And some people could look and say, well, yeah, of course, in the afterlife, except Aristotle didn't even believe in an afterlife. But he said, what your ancestors do could affect your happiness in the future because your descendants could damage your reputation.
Yeah, so, you see this idea that status is a moral virtue change depending on the culture.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So
I think all cultures, to some extent, are on our shame cultures. We don't even realize it most of the time. One of the key examples I'd use for us today of in high school is Facebook. Social media. Everyone wants to get their statuses liked, their videos shared. That's on our shame.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Facebook and Twitter, most social medias are all about the shame. I don't know about the honor, but definitely about the shame.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Right, so he says that relationships and feelings of certainty are also drivers. These both fit under the next category, which is security. So basically, you can crunch all those together. Relationships, feeling of certainty, and security are all sort of the same category. Really, we ultimately seek out relationships and certainty because we want security. So they all fall under the same motivation. So if relationships and certainty didn't lead to security, it's uncertain whether we would pursue them. For instance, some people feel more secure keeping everyone at arm's length. They'd rather hole up in a cabin somewhere with a shotgun in their lap rather than forming strong ties to other people. But all of those fall under Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, meaning that when humans seek out personal needs, they start with food and shelter, and then they seek security. And apparently it's this person's need that motivates good behavior. If that behavior is sociologically expedient. If it isn't, presumably, they wouldn't do it. As an example, if I give my kids all kinds of praise when they clean their room, they might end up cleaning their room just to get that attention. But if I ignore that, but I get in their face when they scream about things, that kid will start screaming all the time to get the attention. Ultimately, the kid doesn't want to do good for good's sake. They want attention. And it doesn't matter whether the attention is good or bad. In their mind, attention is attention. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I also think that most of our moral development, it does start from pure reasons. It can start with just the desire to avoid punishment or the desire to get something good. And then as we mature along the way, we find our motivations start changing. For instance, most of us with marriage today, we sought out someone we thought would be a good spouse, dated them for a while, and then married them. In the ancient world, and many places still today, this isn't how it takes place. Instead, your marriages are arranged, and then the couple comes together, and they don't even know each other. And I think the idea behind it was supposed to form a chemical bond, unbeknownst to them at the time, of course, whereby the man would suddenly desire more and more, hey, I want to be with this woman, but I have to be doing things for her, too. And the woman would generally already have a desire to be loved and feel secure and things of that sort. But I think it was built that way so that if it was working properly, what it would be that the man would be more willing to pursue and love the woman because he still knows it benefits him in the end, too.
Yeah. So, in dating, there's clearly a motivation beyond altruism.
Yeah.
There's essentially two drivers when it comes to romance. One is a need for intimacy. And when I say intimacy, I mean feeling intimate. Have somebody you can share your heart and soul with. And then, of course, there's that other one.
Mm-hmm.
So those two
what's
things.
That other one? What's the other one, Joe?
I believe that in order to find out more about that other one, you should check out a podcast called Deeper Waters, which had an entire episode on that other one.
I think that other one is watching Star Trek together, right?
Yeah, it is. You got it right.
When a man and a woman love each other very much, Nick.
They listen to Weird Al Yankovic together. I know.
That's right. That's right.
Well, then apparently my wife and I don't love each other very much. But my kids and I love each other a lot.
Oh, there you go.
All right, so his final...
I'm still praying for my wife. She doesn't listen to Weird Al, and I hate to say it, but oh gosh, this is so hard. She's never even played the Legend of Zelda games. I don't know where I'm going wrong here. I just don't know.
Well, Nick, it's not her, it's you. Anyway. Getting back to Ben's list, the final motivation he mentions is fairness. Now, I find this one interesting. This is
That's
one that occurs to me because we all hear our kids go, "It's not fair," when they don't get what they want. And I frankly find this amazing. I mean, where did they pick up the word fair? And how do they come by this concept of fairness? When you think about it, fairness is a pretty sophisticated concept. But somehow my 4-year-old is already dabbling in it. I don't see on naturalism how you could easily explain how humans come by the idea of fairness. In order to have fairness, you would need to recognize the personhood of other individuals. Then you need to recognize the human worth of other individuals. Then you need to recognize what constitutes good treatment of other individuals. And after all that, you might be able to access the concept of fairness. So to one extent, I think you could argue a sort of natural law concept of why we know something is right or wrong. But I don't think you could easily explain what motivates acting right or wrong. So in other cultures and societies throughout history, you see everyday people acting in ways that we would consider wrong, because that's what their culture accepts and values. All you have to do is look at schoolyard politics, and you can see this. Left to their own devices, without fully absorbing cultural influences, children act pretty savage, and they find it acceptable.
Lord of the Flies.
Yeah, that came to mind. Well, anyway, it's only within the context, as we've said, of the Western culture, which was founded on Judeo-Christian values, that fairness is considered a motivating principle, as opposed to, say, the social hierarchy of India, which is based on Hinduism and its system of karmic reward and punishment. Western standards of status are based on being kind and generous, rather than being the most savage, aggressive top dog on the pack. And this is what brings us to Christianity. But before I go into that, did you guys want to follow up on all the stuff that I just talked about?
Well, I guess just to say that, bringing up what motivates us is kind of an important point, because you can make all sorts of philosophical arguments that morality is objective and that there are such things as moral facts and duties, but unless you give someone some kind of motivation to actually be and do good, then they're not going to do it. And so the question then becomes, why should we do good? And that gets us back to, well, Christians do good because we believe in God and we want to honor God, and we don't want to bring, as Nick would say, we don't want to bring shame and disgrace to the name of God, and so we do good so that we don't. And our culture has kind of gotten away from this whole shame and disgrace thing, and I'm kind of guessing that's kind of why you see so many Christians behaving badly. Like you have priests abusing children and things like that. And I'm wondering if it's because we've gotten away from this whole idea of shame and honor as a system. It seems like a lot of people today kind of get offended if you try to tell them that shame is a good thing. We have all this opposition to shaming. Things like fat shaming or slut shaming, as they call it. Things like this, where if you even so much as tell someone that they're doing something immorally, they accuse you of shaming them. And so shame has kind of become kind of a modern four-letter word. And so it's something that our culture just kind of opposes tooth and nail.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yes and no, because, if you are fat shaming, then what they do is shame you. And they do it as publicly as possible. And, there's this whole idea of doxing.
I'm not saying bullying, because I definitely don't believe in bullying, and I think bullying is a terrible thing. But a lot of people think that if you just so much as tell someone they're doing something immorally, that you're shaming them. For example, if you try to tell them that having premarital sex is immoral, well, they'll accuse you of, quote, slut shaming, end quote, that person who actually engages in that behavior. So I don't think a lot of times the word shame is actually being used properly either.
I think another word that we use improperly in our society today also is hate. Mm. As if all hate is itself a bad thing. That's a ridiculous position. It certainly isn't. There are some things you ought to hate. Some people out there might be thinking, what kind of things ought you to hate? Okay, how about child abuse? How about rape? How about murder? All those things are things that should be hated. And if you just go out there and say, all hate is bad, then I think it further leads into a kind of attitude that Clinton was talking about, that you can't dare say anything negative about anything or anyone. Well, except for those darn intolerant, bigoted Christians, but that's another matter.
Yeah.
All right.
There you go.
Are you mansplaining right now, Nick?
Am I what?
Are you mansplaining right now?
I don't think so.
No, I was joking.
Okay.
Yeah, another word that we use improperly in Western culture now is literally. I mean, literally means that you're actually doing it. And oftentimes we use literally meaning metaphorically.
Yeah, that is literally my biggest pet peeve, Joel.
I think we should edit the podcast, have Weird Al's word crimes be played at this point. It would be just so appropriately fitting.
There we go. Yeah.
Well, at any rate, let's get back to Christians. Why do Christians act the way they do? So it's worth noting up front that Christians did draw their knowledge of what constitutes good deeds pretty heavily from Scripture, primarily from two mountains. We discover what is required by the law from Mount Sinai and what is desired from law at the Sermon on the Mount. But what motivates us to do good? So in order to talk about that, I want to first talk about a study conducted by a psychologist named Lawrence Kohlberg. Kohlberg wanted to determine what motivates children to act morally and how those motivations change over time. So Kohlberg noticed that kids went through 6 stages of moral development before they fully matured. And the stages are as follows. Stage 1 is obedience and punishment. Now, I think, Clinton, you were the one talking about that, right?
Just say yes. Just say yes.
Okay, sure.
All right. So this stage is common in young children, but you get it with adults as well. At this stage, you see rules as fixed and absolute, and obeying the rules is important because it means to avoid punishment or bad consequence. So your kid won't throw the ball in the house because last time they did that, they were punished, and they don't want to get punished anymore. Second stage is individualism and exchange. So at this stage, the child or adult, whoever, account for individual points of view and judge actions based on how they serve individual needs. So this is kind of a short-sighted type of moral reasoning that focuses on immediate gratification. It's pragmatic in that it only accounts for a type of morality that works. So when he was doing his study, Kohlberg developed what he called the Heinz dilemma. And basically he tells the subject a story about a man who has a sick wife who's on her deathbed, and she needs a certain type of medication. And so her husband, Heinz, he can't afford the medication. He can't borrow the money to buy it or convince the druggist to sell him the medication at a lower cost. So what he does is break in and steals the medicine. And then at the end of the story, you ask the subject to judge whether or not Heinz did the right thing. Clinton, you're a philosopher. Did he do the right thing?
I might need you to repeat that if you could.
Okay. Heinz is this guy. He has a wife and she's dying and she needs medicine. So he goes to the drugstore and he can't afford the medicine. He can't borrow the money and he can't convince the pharmacy to sell him the medicine at a lower cost. So ultimately what he does is he steals the medicine. And the question is, did he do the right thing?
Yeah, that's definitely a dilemma. I would say that he probably did not do the right thing, but what he did was very much understandable, and I could not say that I would not. I'm not 100% certain that I would not also do the same thing in that situation, but morally speaking, I would say it was probably the wrong thing to do.
Okay. Nick?
I honestly think, as a husband, if I had to, provided it wasn't something like murdering someone or something that's whoops, I would probably go and steal something if I had to save my wife's life as well. I think it's doing the thing, breaking the lesser law to uphold the greater one, the value of saving life.
Okay.
It's a tricky one because I think typically for moral obligations, the proper framework is right response to reality. And I'm not sure that breaking and entering is the right response, although part of it is because I'm not sure I agree with all the confines. It seems like there could be other options, such as, having other people help, going to church. I think there are other options that are available to him, so I'm not sure that it's there. However, you could make, if that was the only option available, and you could stipulate that as part of the thought experiment, then are we dealing with, Nazis at your front door, Jews in your attic? Is it permissible then to engage in lying, deception, which is normally something that would be morally obligatory to refrain from? Is it permissible then in that case to uphold a greater ethic? And in that case, I think that you might have a good case for it there.
Yeah, these are called moral dilemmas for a reason.
And remember, even Proverbs says people don't follow the man if he steals bread when he's hungry.
Yeah, they don't fault him for it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the act itself was moral. And like Tyler was saying, especially if there are other avenues that you can pursue, then it seems like you should pursue those avenues. Like if your family is starving, don't go steal a loaf of bread from the store. Go down to the local, food kitchen or go to a church, see if they can help you out with some groceries or some money, things like that. So if there are other options, then certainly it seems like those should be pursued instead.
I agree with that entirely. I mean, when I gave my response, it was kind of like assuming you have tried every single other option. And for me, I mean, if my wife's life was on the line, then, I'd do whatever I had to in that case.
Yeah, I think this is like a Kobayashi Maru. There's no way out. I think that was the point of the experiment. Was his options were let his wife die or commit a crime.
Yeah, and there are other things that kind of weigh into the moral equation also. Like Tyler brought up the whole thing about if the Nazis come to your door asking if you have Jews, do you lie to them or do you hand over the Jews? Well, that's not exactly comparable to the situation because no one is trying to murder your wife. They're just keeping medication away from her because you can't afford it. And so there's that disanalogy between the two. So then that might weigh into the moral equation too. So there are a number of different things that can kind of change the moral equation if you consider them.
Yeah, I think with the Nazi thing, there's a volitional aspect to that because the Nazis are intentional in their desire to kill the Jew. So because they're intentional, whereas the pharmacist is just following the societal norms. He's following the rule of the land, so to speak. So he does nothing wrong.
Or he might be, predicting his job or something. He knows he might get fired if he gives you the medication without paying for it, or all these kinds of things too.
Yeah,
of course. In our society today, it could be if this kind of story ever happened. Like, let's suppose, God forbid, it did, and I've already said, I do something. Let's suppose it was Allie who was in need, and I took something. Our society today, they might have more problems with a pharmacist than they'd have with me. Saying, geez, why didn't the pharmacist have it? This was to save a life. Why didn't we do that?
Yeah. Well, anyway, Kohlberg with the kids basically said the same thing you did, Nick, that, it was not wrong for him to steal because that was the action that worked in that situation. It was the utilitarian action, so to speak. And it best served the needs of poor Heinz. All right, so that was stage 2. Stage 3, Kohlberg called interpersonal relationships. So at this stage, the subject becomes concerned with how their behavior is perceived by others. The subject wants to live up to social expectations and roles and be seen as a good boy or a good girl. They want others to like them, especially those with which they have a close relationship. So we're at stage 4. There's 6 stages. In this stage, he called maintaining social order. And at this stage the subject begins to adopt a broader view of morality, one that is not simply to benefit themselves, but as society as a whole. So law and order must be upheld, and courteous, as well as law-abiding behavior, such as what you mentioned, Nick, holding the door for a disabled person, or allowing somebody to merge ahead of yourself in traffic, those kinds of things benefit everyone.
People can let them merge from ahead of them in traffic? That actually happens?
No, but it's possible.
Okay, because I live in Georgia. I haven't seen that happen.
Well, I've been known to do that on occasion, but
yeah, you keep that crazy talk out of L.A., man. We don't do that here.
That's true. Yeah, I driving through LA really has given me a crash course on driving aggressively.
Isn't the rule of LA driving kill or be killed?
Pretty close. It's like road rules out here.
Every time you're on the road, there's road rules.
Look, Tyler, just especially watch out if you ever see any blue shells flying overhead. You could be in a world of hurt.
It's true. It's true. Although, and I posted this earlier, every single time I see a highway patrol on the motorcycle cop, I always wonder if Terminator 2 is coming true.
Don't be absurd, Tyler. Robots aren't about to impersonate humans anytime soon. You are being paranoid.
You guys realize that we tried to record an episode on self-aware AI on this podcast like 3 separate times, and every one we had technical issues?
Oh. I hadn't heard that.
I think it's because Skynet was messing with us every time.
I think that was the thing that the point I was trying to make there, Nick. Well, anyway,
yeah.
There is a possible world in which you could allow somebody to merge in front of you in traffic.
I'm going to take the bait, Joel. Move on.
Yeah, it sure isn't this world, whichever world that is.
Well, at any rate, that was that stage, stage 4. Stage 5 is the social contract stage. And you've all heard of social contracts, I'm sure, but for the listeners' sake, at this stage, the subject becomes aware of the values and ideals of other individuals and differentiates between these and the larger laws of social order. So a person at this stage would choose as much as possible to be sensitive and courteous to what others feel is important, even if such things are not particularly important to them. And finally, stage 6 is universal principles. So at this final stage, Kohlberg indicates that the subject has internalized a set of universal moral principles that apply to everyone, regardless of the laws of the land or social standards. So this person will appeal to a higher principle of morality, even if it contradicts what others assert, and will strive to realize these values. So that was Kohlberg. Any further thoughts you guys have on his assessment of moral development, the different stages?
I'm just worried about this whole idea. I mean, we're supposed to reach a stage where we actually, want to do good for other people just because. When's this supposed to happen?
I don't know. I was going to make the possible world joke, but I've already done that, so we have to move on.
So we live in a possible world in which you didn't make that joke twice.
Yes, we do.
All right.
All right, I don't need to tell you guys that people don't actually mature through all such stages. We get people stuck at one of the stages for life, often.
I think if we're talking about empathy, also an interesting case we could bring up would be someone I'm sure many of us know about, and that would be David Wood, the Christian philosopher who especially works well in dealing with Islam, who is actually a bona fide psychopath.
That's true. And what I wouldn't give to sit down and have a conversation with him about that, because I think that would be very informative when it comes to...
I've also heard he impersonates Chad Gross as well.
Yeah.
I thought, and I could be wrong, I thought he was a certified sociopath.
He sociopath, I think he kind of uses them kind of interchangeably, but he did get a letter when someone wrote him to him and said, "You're a psychopath." And he just says, "Technically, yes."
Because I thought he lacked. I thought because a sociopath is someone who lacks empathy and the ability to self-actualize other people's emotions and stuff. Psychopath, as far as I understand it, is someone who has some type of psychosis, like schizophrenia or something like that. That's motivating their actions.
Yeah, so
he does.
That's incorrect. Actually, sociopath was a term that was invented, but it's almost interchangeable with psychopath. Psychopath is somebody who lacks any kind of empathy and sees people as objects, essentially. Most psychopaths are extremely intelligent, and they're usually able to kind of manipulate people for their own ends. So they usually come off as very charming and ingratiating people, but they tend to be very manipulative.
Well, David Wood and Nabil Qureshi, who actually my wife informs me his passing away was exactly 2 years ago today. They were very close friends. I understand when David got the call about Nabil had cancer, it was well, that sucks. And that was pretty much it. And Ari and I have talked to him on the phone before, and we were just kind of amazed by this. And we said, so are you telling us like, if your wife and kids died, you really wouldn't fear anything and such? He said, well, I'd like to think I would, but based on past experience, no, I probably wouldn't. And I can't even find, but he is, well, I've seen one of the most loving husbands there is out there.
Yeah. No, I mean, I would love to have that conversation with him. I would, because I understand a lot about psychopaths. I actually worked with one as a child. I'm sorry. I worked with a child who was a psychopath. And it was fascinating because I watched him developing and learning how to manipulate, which was rather frightening at the time. But, I would love to sit down with David Wood and find out how he operates in terms of determining what is moral and what motivates that.
Now, was he diagnosed a psychopath before or after becoming a Christian?
It would be before. Okay, so I don't know if he was actually diagnosed before he went to prison, but by the time he went to prison, he was definitely diagnosed.
Oh, no, I didn't know he went to prison. I said before or after he became a Christian.
Right, he became a Christian in prison.
Oh, okay, yeah, I didn't know that. Okay. Because David Wood, I don't know personally, and I don't know that much about him, but I did watch a debate he did versus John Loftus, and I've seen a lot of debates with William Lane Craig, because he's one of my favorite debaters, but David Wood in that debate with John Loftus, I think, was hands down my all-time favorite opening speech that I've ever seen from any Christian debater. It was really good, and I was actually surprised to learn that actually is a psychopath.
Yeah, well, I find it encouraging, actually, because it shows me that it's possible to both be a psychopath and a very moral person.
Right.
Well, anyways, getting back to my thing, if you guys are done.
Wait, you're still here?
Yeah. All right, so what I recognized when I went through those stages is that you do kind of see these same stages in progress through Scripture itself. So, for instance, in the Garden of Eden, the only motivation God gives Adam and Eve to not break the law is that if they break the law, they're going to die. So this is punishment-reward. It doesn't get much simpler than that. But by the time we get to Sinai, God is giving people a sort of social contract, although it still has elements of punishment and reward built into it. And then by the time, prophets come around, especially some of the more sophisticated books of prophecy, God is telling them to do justly and love mercy and walk humbly with your God, which looks a lot like the social order stage. And then by the time you get to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is teaching universal principles. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied, and so forth. And in theology, we would call this progressive revelation, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So what this means is that over the course of Scripture, we get more and more sophisticated in the moral teaching and in our knowledge of God's nature. And this dispensation of moral law looks a lot like the stages developed, outlined by Kohlberg. So when it comes right down to it, what is the Christian's motivation for doing good? Is it fear of hell and a longing for heaven? Well, firstly, they didn't have any well-developed concept of heaven and hell in the Old Testament. Their concept was the Promised Land. The better they behaved, the more the Promised Land would flourish, and the better their inheritance would be through Abraham. And then the worse they behaved, the more the Promised Land would degrade, and the further they would be separated from the land.
You read John 1, one of the biggest themes he pushes on covenant is the idea of, well, covenant. And that's something we've largely lost sight of, except for perhaps marriage. We still see that, but we don't really understand covenants today.
Although, I mean, we could draw some sort of a contrast between a covenant and a legal agreement, but it's not quite the same thing. Anyways, through the Old Testament, you have what would look to us like these really bizarre visions of prophets as they're being told to measure the dimensions of the temple, and they watch God's glory separate from the land and watch the land sort of suffer and degrade. And in then the book of Revelation, what do we see? We see this glorious city of New Jerusalem descending from the sky and finally perfect the land Abraham had been promised. And in the New Testament, we're told that Abraham sought out a city not built by human hands, whose builder and maker was God. So they were looking for a city which was built from heaven down, not from the earth up. Which, I see a contrast myself between the Tower of Babel story and then this vision of the, New Jerusalem descending from the sky. I don't know if that's intentional, but I like it.
You also see a reversal of Babel at the coming of Pentecost. And it's pretty much everything's going in reverse. We get the New Testament that Jesus comes and he takes everything bad that happened and he starts undoing it.
Yeah, I mean, and you were talking about the reversal of Babel. I think you see that in Revelation just a bit when it talks about every tongue and tribe and nation are bowing down to God. You see this sort of them coming back together as opposed to being split apart. All right, so this concept of heaven and hell, it's sort of a later idea, which I think Christians have largely misinterpreted. But that's not the point. The point is this.
Yeah, we have.
Jesus says, quote, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." So what's he saying? He's saying that we look to God as our standard. Our ultimate desire is to be like God. Now, how do I know this? Because Paul says, "Be imitators of God as beloved children." So, first of all, we've got that Jesus saying, "Be perfect." Well, why are we perfect? Because we're imitating our Father as beloved children. So Paul is telling us that we need to be like a kid who's watching his father. So, yeah, your kids watch you, and they imitate you, and they get their idea of how a man is supposed to act directly from how you act. And Paul's saying to be like that. We watch God, and we copy him because, like a kid who loves his dad, we're looking at him to figure out what it looks like to be perfect. So what motivates us to do that? Well, put simply, it's love. In the Old Testament, we're told to love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your mind, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. And what motivates us to love him? This we get from John. He says, we love him because he first loved us. So in the Old Testament, we're told that God desires mercy, not sacrifice. But what motivates us to be merciful? Jesus tells us to forgive one another just as God has forgiven you. So if we're using the Bible at all, what we see is that heaven and hell ought to have nothing to do with our moral motivations. What compels me to act morally towards others is that as a Christian, I have love towards God. I'm so grateful that God has forgiven me, something I didn't deserve at all, that I forgive other people. Because to do otherwise would be an act of ingratitude. And I would do anything to show my gratitude to God who loved me, even though I didn't deserve it. And why do I love others? Because I love God. I want to imitate my Father for the sole reason that He is my Father, and my desire is to please Him, and it isn't out of a sense of obligation or fear. It's out of a sense of overwhelming love and gratitude. My love towards others is a gift to God, and I have a deep desire in my soul to give gifts to my Father. Now, I can't think of a more selfless or pure motivation than that. It's not something that drives me, it's something that pulls me, so to speak. What do you think?
I think something also that Paul says that really gives me pause when I think about it is how he said, not only just be like God, he said, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And I think, I don't know many of us who could say the exact same thing. You could, like I say, if you want to see what Christ would be like, just look at me here, okay? I'll show you.
This idea that we act out of fear of hell seems to be rooted in this sort of primitive notion that our salvation is dependent on our good works. I don't run into too many atheists who have a strong understanding of the doctrine of grace. Do you guys have that problem?
I think it would help us if many of us Christians had a strong concept of the doctrine of grace.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as many atheists tend to be former Christians, that's probably why so many atheists don't have a very robust understanding of grace.
No, I agree. It's actually, that's from childhood. I've always tried to impress upon my kids forgiveness. I'm not talking about how God wants to love you if you do good or, trying to talk about obedience and so forth. I talk about forgiveness because implicit in the idea of forgiveness is that, we're going to screw up. But God is a God of forgiveness, and that's not wrong. And this is why we love God and are motivated. It's just what I talked about. We're forgiving because we've been forgiven. And this is what I want to drive home for my kids, specifically because I study and I interact with former Christians. I kind of know what the bad doctrines are.
Yeah, I think, Angel, you and I know this both very well, having both of us being on the path of marriage. And I remember some lady once when I worked at Walmart, a girl came up to me and said, Nick, you seem like a really wise, spiritual guy. What's the best way you think that I can really learn forgiveness? I said, okay, get married. You're going to spend a lot of your time either giving it or receiving it, and I'll spend a whole lot more time receiving it. But honestly, whenever Allie does anything that's wrong to me, and I'm talking about something that is a bona fide wrong, I can get upset about it. And yes, that sometimes happens. But then she asked, why are you forgiving me? Why are you? And I said, because when I sit down and look at it, anything you do to me, I've done worse to God. And He forgives me. And if I'm going to be consistent, I forgive you too.
Yeah. So, Christian or non-Christians, these atheists that we're talking about, their assumption is that it's fear and, desire, selfishness that drives our actions. And, this harkens back to the oldest religious structure, this karmic idea. We have, like, for instance, the Egyptian notion that when we die, Horus weighs our heart against a feather, and if they outweigh the feather, we end up in the bad part of the afterlife.
Horus is that guy that Jesus copied from, right?
Yeah, he was a dying and rising god that was born of a virgin and had 12 disciples, or something like that, I don't know.
Yeah, and he was also the guy that appeared a couple of times to Hans Fine, right?
Yes. Actually, no, that was Mithras.
Oh, that was Mithras. Okay, I get those pagan gods confused.
No, Mithras was totally ripping off a horse.
Think about that was Quetzalcoatl, now that I think about it.
Oh, right. Yeah. Oh, don't forget Gozer the Zarian.
Yeah.
Solid.
That's from Ghostbusters.
Right. Dang it, why did so many people still know that movie? It actually happens to be one of my favorite movies, so that's how I know it.
It's a very quotable movie, if nothing else.
Yeah. Oh, no. No, never mind. Gozer was from number 2, wasn't he?
I think Gozer was from the first one.
No, Gozer was the first one.
The first one, okay, yeah. Right. Okay, yeah. So, the first one, I really enjoyed that one. Of course, the second one was pretty lackluster. It's still a good movie, I would argue, but, kind of a repeat of the first one.
I think it's kind of odd to say this is one of your favorite movies and you can't remember who the main villain was.
Oh,
yeah, I hedged a little bit because I'm thinking, oh wait, no, was Gozer the god that was in the painting? And so that's why, I'll hang my head in shame.
Yeah, please do.
It's been a little while since I've seen it.
Well, we can rest assured that Gozer wasn't the first one because I just looked it up and I did see it on Wikipedia, so that kind of settles everything, you know?
All right, there you go.
Okay, Clinton. Don't tell nobody,
Yeah.
but I actually follow you on social media, and I've been following the discussion you've been having with this next session. So lay it out for us.
All right. Yeah, this was a very, very bizarre kind of conversation that I had with somebody. The argument is nothing new. You'll even hear some of the so-called new atheists bring up this kind of argument in their debates with William Lane Craig. The argument basically goes that everyone's an atheist, but atheists just go one god further than Christians do, and so the implication being that Christians reject all other gods, and for the same reason that Christians reject all other gods, atheists reject the Christian God, and so therefore they're really fundamentally different than the Christian. The Christian just picks and chooses the God that he apparently likes the best or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I had this discussion with somebody, and I believe it was on the Atheist Who Shall Not Be Named's Facebook wall. It was one of his friends. I don't know if he knows the guy in real life or if he's just a Facebook acquaintance. But this guy that I was talking to, this atheist, he used this argument on me, and I responded to it. But then, he wouldn't let it go. When I tried to tell him, well, no, I'm a Christian because I believe in a God. He was very, very insistent that I admit that I am just no different than an atheist. And he would even go so far as to say things like, we don't have the right to our own definitions. You are an atheist. So it was just a really, really, that's a really strange hill to die on. Trying to insist that a Christian, call himself an atheist. But that was what kind of went on. And I kind of just, lost interest in the discussion because he was clearly not reasoning very well.
Yeah, so this kind of comes from the outsider test idea. I don't know which came first, this one God further or the outsider test, but it's the premise upon which the outsider test is built, which is to say that, you reject all the other gods, and so your predilection to believe in your God is just sort of a bias. If you were to look at your religion in the same light that you look at all the other religions, you would realize yours is just as ridiculous and you would reject it. So,
not to be needlessly mean or mean-spirited or anything to John Loftus, but I'm a little bit familiar with Loftus's work, and he is not an original thinker, and so I'm 99% positive that the we're all atheist argument came first, and then Loftus just kind of capitalized on that with his outsider test for faith.
Yeah, so I have gained a new appreciation for the outsider test, which is something I never thought I'd hear myself say, especially since we lampooned it very heavily in the first episodes of this podcast.
Okay, everyone, Zoe's been kidnapped now. We have to go out and... Actually, why do we have to do that? Why don't we just let the kidnappers happen?
Oh, you care. Anyway, here's what I mean. The outsider test, I never really understood it before because I thought it was sort of an evidential type thing where you built these arguments against other religions and then you turned those arguments back around to yours. But that's not what it is at all. And I had to hear Loftus in a debate to really get that. What he's saying is that religions sound ridiculous. So that when I hear a Mormon say that there was some kind of Israelite that traveled over to early America and then had kids and they broke up into tribes and they warred against others and then there were these gold tablets that were delivered by an angel. Yeah, you get the idea. It all sounds really, really ridiculous. But then if I were to stand on the outside of my religion and hear somebody say, yeah, this virgin totally got impregnated and had a kid and so forth, that would sound equally ridiculous. The only reason it doesn't sound ridiculous to me is I'm on the inside looking out. So it's essentially...
So Joe, to make sure, are you saying that you do affirm the virgin birth, which I do affirm?
Moving on. So Loftus's argument is purely the argument of incredulity. It sounds ridiculous, but you don't get how it's ridiculous.
Yeah, so I've read Loftus's book on the outsider test for faith. Mm-hmm. It's been a little while since I read it. It didn't occur to me that it was similar to the we're all atheist argument. Otherwise, I might have skimmed through it to refamiliarize myself with it before this podcast. But from what I remember, yeah, it's based on an argument from incredulity, but it's also based on another logical fallacy, the genetic fallacy. That, you were born, if you were born in Saudi Arabia, you'd be a Muslim. If you were born in, Scandinavia, you'd probably be an atheist or something. And so it's based also on the genetic fallacy that if you're born in a certain area, then you're more likely to be whatever religion that area or culture believes in. And so you have these kind of assumed biases that you're not really familiar with. And so in order to really test to see whether or not your religion is correct, you need to kind of step out from your religion and you need to examine it as an outsider would examine it. And he says that if you do that, then every religion will see that it's actually false. And so the thing is that it's also based on not like another specific logical fallacy, but it's also actually self-defeating. And this is something that Loftus doesn't understand, is that his own argument is self-defeating because then you also have to apply that to atheism. But Loftus tries to get around this problem by trying to argue that atheism itself is exempt from the outsider test for faith because it doesn't make any sort of claims upon reality.
Yeah, so it's a lack of beliefs.
Right, yeah.
So
yeah, he's one of the lack of belief atheists.
Yeah.
If I could jump in and say a few things with the whole thing about one God fervor, if you believe in any sort of God whatsoever, you can't really be properly called an atheist at all. So that whole thing doesn't work. And can you imagine any defense lawyer standing up in a courtroom and saying, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we all agree that so many people in here did not commit the murder. I just ask that you look at my client and go one person fervor." It's an argument that no one would use. And finally, there's a book that's going to be coming out. It's not already out, but I get advanced copies for we use such. Stephen Parrish, a fine Lutheran philosopher, has written a book, Atheism, A Critical Analysis. And a lot of the stuff we're talking about, stuff that you're seeing popular atheism, it's in there. So I'm about 4/6 of the way through it. I really recommend people getting to it.
Yeah. Okay. Joel and Nick, we're all bachelors. I just go one woman further than you guys do.
Wow.
Or do we go one woman further than you? Think about that now.
Oh. Yeah, okay. Oh, yeah.
But the reason that I say I have a new appreciation for it is that, okay, so I have listened recently to a lot of Muslim Christian debates, and I start to hear Muslims make a lot of the same types of arguments that I've heard Christians make. And, I suddenly understand how those arguments sound to outside ears. And it hasn't made me think, oh, Christianity must be wrong because we sound ridiculous just like they do. What it has made me realize is we need to be very careful about the way in which we present our arguments and our faith, because now I know what they sound like from the outside. And, if we're sounding ridiculous, it's not particularly helpful to our case.
Right.
So there are certain arguments I would avoid. The one that keeps coming up in these debates is the sort of scientific argument for the Quran. And they'll, take these things which are really, really speculative and tentative and try to tie to scientific ideas. And I've heard people do similar things with the Bible. And so these are arguments that I would avoid because, they don't sound great.
Yeah. Yeah, growing up, I had friends who were heavily into the Way of the Master, which was Ray Comfort and Kirk Cameron's bread and butter, I guess, in the Christian evangelism community. And yeah, they actually printed up a pamphlet that basically talked about, like, I think it was 100 or so scientific facts in the Bible, where they were trying to use these scriptures to indicate that the Bible was ahead of its time when it came to revealing scientific truth. And yeah, I think that's kind of a wrong way to go about it, because I totally think it's fine, even if the Bible teaches that the Earth is flat, which it doesn't, because that's never been a majority view ever since at least time of the ancient Greeks. It's never been a widely held view. Or even if the Earth actually does teach a geocentric form of the universe, of the galaxy or the universe, all of these things, even if God is working through the understood science of the time, I don't see that as problematic, because God was speaking to the people who were there in the present time. And so if he would have spoken using advanced knowledge that the people were unfamiliar with, well, that wouldn't have gone over very well. They wouldn't have believed him, or they wouldn't have understood it, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I could go either way with that, but, my whole point is, with the outsider test, step outside as you're communicating with other people and think about how it must sound to them. I don't think it's a great test for determining the truth or falsity of your beliefs, but it is a good test for determining how we ought to communicate.
Yeah, I think there's definitely benefit there to learn how to communicate to people who don't hold to your beliefs better.
Yeah. Anyway, back to your thing, Clinton. I totally derailed you there.
Oh, no, that's fine. Yeah, because, I mean, that's pretty much what I had. I was in that discussion with that atheist, and he was trying to kind of box me in, trying to make me admit that I was an atheist, and that was just a really ridiculous kind of conversation. But yeah, I think that this is a fairly common phrase, especially among my discussions, that we're all atheists. They just go one God further than we do, which of course is, it's not using the term atheist or theist in a way that those words actually mean.
Yeah, I am not disinclined to engage atheists, except for the fact they're always bringing up the same three arguments, and it just becomes boring after a while. It's disinteresting. I don't hear anything new or interesting from them. Yeah,
I get that, and as a Christian, it's easy for the atheist. I mean, if the atheist wants to make claims that they have to support, that's great. That's one thing that makes the conversation more interesting. But really, the atheist doesn't really have, as far as they're concerned, they don't really have anything to lose by by not committing to a viewpoint. It's taking this, I just deny God exists. I don't actually claim that God doesn't, so you have the burden of proof. It's the Christian who really wants to convince, because the Christian believes that the atheist is on the path to destruction after they die. And so the Christian really wants to convince the atheist, an atheist who is not very motivated to come to true things about reality, doesn't really lose anything as far as their argumentation is concerned by trying to avoid the burden of proof altogether.
Yeah, it's really easy being an atheist because, you don't need to make any claims. All you need to do is find holes and keep asking difficult questions and so forth. And, because there's this idea of the burden of proof that, it's sort of like a courtroom and they're in the jury box and you can lay out all the evidence in front of them. And then at the end of the day, they can just say, well, that doesn't convince me. And, they walk away and they've won the day because they weren't convinced. And it's your job to convince them. Which is convenient. So they don't have to make any assertions. They can just sit there and nitpick with questions. And just do that all day. And they don't have to ground anything they believe. In fact, they often deny belief in general. Yeah, they've got a pretty good job. I would make a great atheist.
Yeah.
Actually, I wouldn't, because I'd be searching for some kind of interesting argument, and I've sat there, I've thought about it. I can't find too many interesting arguments against Christianity.
Yeah. Because there are two arguments against Christianity which I find fairly compelling. I think Christianity provides good responses to them, but they kind of give me pause. I don't think they're very strong arguments. They're more like emotionally compelling than they are logically sound or logically compelling, and so that's why I don't really pay them too much mind. But I if someone is more of an emotional thinker than a logical thinker, I can understand why those would kind of keep them away. Yeah.
I'm assuming you're talking about the problem of evil.
Problem of evil is one, and divine hiddenness is the other, because divine hiddenness is something I still kind of struggle with as a Christian. But again, I think that Christianity provides good responses to it, and so even though I wish God was more available, it doesn't really bother me too much that he's not, because
Yeah,
I think he's there just in a way that is not as accessible as any of the human beings that I know.
Yeah, I could go into the hiddenness thing, but that would be another episode, so yeah, let's not do that right now. Okay, so before we go, I've got a treat for us. It's time for Listener Mail!
You've got mail.
Today's epistle, it means letter, look it up, comes to us courtesy of Adrian of Bristol, UK. Hey, Adrian. Adrian says, Joel, you mentioned the unbeliever's trope, extraordinary claims regard extraordinary evidence, when in fact extraordinary claims require satisfactory evidence. So Adrian here is talking about the last episode when I strayed off into the bushes bringing up the whole extraordinary evidence, etc. I'm so happy we got this question because, for once, I have a much better idea what it means when they say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. See, I was just doing work last week and I ran across this. I quote, "What constitutes extraordinary evidence? In the strictest sense, and the sense that should be employed when evaluating claims of educational effectiveness, evidence is the outcome of the application of the scientific method to test the effectiveness of a claim, a theory, or a practice. The more rigorously the test is conducted, the more often the test is replicated, the more extensively the test is corroborated, the more extraordinary the evidence. Evidence becomes extraordinary when it is extraordinarily well tested." So that's the textbook definition of extraordinary evidence. And I mean that literally. This definition came from a graduate-level textbook. The book itself was specialized, but this came from the first chapter of the book, which dealt with the philosophy of science. Essentially, why do we do science before it gets into the science? Mm-hmm. So, what is this saying in effect? Basically, the more extraordinary the claim, the more rigorous the testing that would be required to verify it. So let me give you an example from my own field of behavioral analysis. Let's say that someone came to me and complained that their kid keeps throwing her sippy cup across the room when she's told it's time to go to bed. So the first thing I would apply would be the common sense test. Is the claim counter to general experience? No. Toddlers are known to throw tantrums and resist bedtime. Does that mean the parent's telling the truth? No, but the claim is consistent with personal experience, so it isn't particularly extraordinary. Now let's say that someone comes in and tells me that they can see sounds and hear colors. I apply the common sense test and it fails. This is not consistent with my experience, so we can call it uncommon. But is it extraordinary? We don't know yet. So the next thing I do is I check the research. Back when Carl Sagan coined the so-called Sagan standard, checking the research was a pretty exhausting process. You had to go to the biggest university library you could find, then cross-index about 200 books as thick as your torso. Now we go to a very small university library, jump on the computer, type some keywords, and we can get all the research on the topic. Once I do that, I discover that there actually is a condition where you can see sounds and hear color. It's a neurological condition called synesthesia. You ever hear of that, Clinton?
I have, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought it was incredibly fascinating the first time when I heard it.
Yeah. So what we've got is an uncommon claim, but not yet extraordinary. So let's say that someone comes in and tells me their kid woke up one morning and the kid was now speaking French, and they never even heard French. Common sense test fails. This is unusual. So I check the literature. Turns out there is a condition called xenoglossy, where people are reported to suddenly speak a different language. But here's the thing. There's practically no scientific evidence for xenoglossy. So let's say I do find one study about xenoglossy. Does that constitute evidence? Not according to the textbook definition. And that's the thing. There are probably in the area of millions of published researches that have not been corroborated. Some of this research sits around on shelves for decades, but no one tries to replicate it. And this is a big concern in the scientific fields. So when I entered my postgrad work and I started thinking about theses and dissertations and so forth, I was all like, I'm going to do something original and groundbreaking. And the university was all like, nope, you're going to find research that's already been done and you're going to replicate it. And I'm thinking, what's the point? The point is that science is self-correcting. Some studies fabricate data. Sometimes they get it wrong. And if no one ever tries to replicate the study using the same methods, its veracity remains in question. But the more that study is replicated with similar results, the more it can be trusted. So xenoglossy is not well corroborated. What's the next step? Well, I go out and I study it. I look into the kid's history. I interview and submit surveys to everyone the kids are in contact with. I observe the kid in her home and school environment. I record my observations. I have somebody fluent in French go over the recordings. I can do EEGs and MRIs and genetic testing and so forth. I gather every bit of data I get on the child. Once I've done every bit of observation and testing I can, I submit it to my peers, and they see if there are any flaws in my data or testing. So once I've done all this, the evidence has been shown to be extraordinary. So that's the definition of extraordinary evidence. Clinton, what do you think?
Extraordinary evidence just kind of like ordinary evidence to me. It's just you have to be a little bit more diligent because the evidence isn't there. But all of the things you're doing, going and testing it, having someone who's fluent in French going over the recorded evidence, all that kind of stuff, there's nothing extraordinary about that. You're just trying to corroborate this claim that this kid can actually speak French now, not having ever heard a word of it. So it doesn't really sound like extraordinary evidence to me. It just seems like because there is no or very little corroborating evidence that you have to be more diligent in seeking out actual evidence to prove the claim.
Yeah, so the point you're making essentially is that nothing I have gathered at this point is unusual. All the data that I'm gathering is exactly what you would gather for the case. But the definition that I read from the textbook indicates that it's not the type of evidence that you gather, it's the amount of evidence that you gather. So, like I said, you go into the studies, you go into the literature. If there have been very few studies, it's not sufficient evidence. It's not sufficient to be extraordinary. You go and you do the and you do so many tests and you get as many observations as you can. And once you just get a massive amount of evidence, that's what makes it extraordinary. At least from what I understand from the definition I just read.
Yeah, so I guess because one question that always pops into my head whenever someone makes this claim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is what makes a claim extraordinary. Now you talked about I don't know if that was from the book or if that was from your own personal experience about how you have the common sense claim, you have the unusual claim, and then the extraordinary claim. So in this context, is an extraordinary claim just a claim that's been made with very little corroborating evidence?
Yeah, so the best I can gather from the textbook is that it's a claim that has no current evidence or study or anything backing it up. That's why I said the first thing you do is you go to the literature. So you go to all of the scientific studies and so forth that you can find, and if there are no studies on this particular condition or phenomena or whatever, then it is an extraordinary claim because it has not been studied.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
So, obviously, it would be nearly impossible to apply this to a miracle claim. I mean, I guess you could probably, go to Benny Hinn and, he's doing this nightly, and so it would be easy enough to kind of do a test on somebody's medical condition previous to going on stage, and then after they come down from the stage, and you could do this kind of robustly because you can measure everybody who's going in, you can do all kinds of medical tests on them. So I suppose you could do this kind of thing with modern-day miracle claims like that. And, people do. There's a big industry in debunking the paranormal or any kind of supernatural claim. It's just kind of a thing we do.
Yeah. Yeah, and even in the other direction, there's that book, Miracles by Craig Keener, in which he has actually examined and investigated miracle claims.
Yeah. So, I suppose what the scientist would say is, okay, you've shown that we don't know how it's done, but then we don't know how it's done. And that's because you honestly can't weigh or, gauge or do a spectroscope or anything on a miracle. Miracles are, by definition, beyond scientific testing. So, what do we would do with biblical miracles? And this is where they get you. If it were possible to do, say, put a beaker full of purified water and test its chemical contents, and then lock it in a hermetically sealed container and put sensors on it, and then put recording devices around the laboratory, and then, you bring Jesus in, you strip him down to make sure he's got nothing up his sleeve, and then he turns the water into wine. And then we unseal it, and we do tests on the wine, and, the test would let us judge the age and the vintage of the grapes, and we could probably even tell what area of the country the grapes were grown in and so forth. And at that point, you've tested the biblical, but you can't.
Yeah, the problem with that is because we're so far removed from, for example, the time that Jesus walked on the earth, that it's basically impossible to give them any robust evidence. Now, we can look at the biblical passages. For example, there's the account of Thomas who said, look, I'm not going to believe that Christ rose from the dead unless I can actually feel the holes in his hands and in his side. And then Jesus appears to the disciples, with Thomas included. Lo and behold, Thomas, feels the holes and then worships God because he realizes that the claims of Christ's resurrection is true. Now, it seems like Thomas received the kind of evidence that they would require for this miracle claim. So, but the problem is, we don't have access to that evidence because we live 2,000 years later, and so all we can rely on now are just eyewitness testimonies. So, so it seems like there has been extraordinary evidence given. We just don't have access to it because we live so far after all of these events took place.
Yeah. That's a solid point, and I want to address that in a second, but, I mean, let me use the plagues of Egypt as an example here, based on what we've been talking about. You don't have the ability to, say, put the Nile water under a microscope after it's been turned blood, or, put it in a centrifuge and separate the platelets and so forth. It comes, it fails the common sense test, so then we check the literature, and you might, see an instance where water turns blood-like because there's a type of algae that grows practically overnight, and it turns the water like a bloody red. And, that's in the literature. So we have a recorded episode, we also have episodes where, frogs actually fall from the sky. And this is supposedly it's due to like water spouts that touch down in bodies of water and pick up aquatic animals and, then drop them miles away, like a sharknado.
Frognado.
Yeah, Frognado. So that actually has happened in the past, and we have, instances where that happens with frogs or fish or other aquatic animals. And then, of course, there's nothing supernatural about plagues of lice or flies or, diseases on animals or hailstorms or even eclipses. So honestly, the only plague in there that really can't be ascribed to something natural would be the death of the firstborn. Because, there's no, it's targeting the firstborn male of every family that doesn't have blood on their doorway. There's no naturalistic explanation I can think of. It's a very intentional sort of plague, if you will. Now, don't hear me to be saying that all of these miraculous events were just natural occurrences. I mean, they might have been, which would be no less effective to the point God was making, but they could also be purely supernatural. I don't have a problem with that. But there's no corroboration of these events. So the only miraculous events that really survive the second standard are prophecies that we can pretty clearly tell happened prior to the events they prophesied. So you have this in, like, Daniel's prophecies. He wrote these significantly before Alexander the Great or, the rise of Rome and so forth, which becomes kind of a problem for Bible scholars. They sort of have to, add a few years to when the books were written and subtract a couple of conquerors from it and so forth to make up for the seemingly miraculous nature. And, so prophecies kind of survive this to an extent, but what really rises over it would be, because prophecies, you can always go back and say, well, they're vague, kind of like what a fortune teller would do or a horoscope would do to sort of fool you just because of the vagueness and the very symbolic nature. So prophecies aren't great for that. But, you said Jesus, the Gospels. And I think that that's probably the strongest evidence that we have, because you've got really strong evidence that he died. It's 2,000 years later. He died at some point. And, this was a Roman executioner, so they were good at their job. And, lots of eyewitnesses. And then we have a lot of evidence that he rose, because you've got a lot of testimony and eyewitnesses and external corroboration and so forth. So that's my thought. What do you think, Clinton?
One of the most common criticisms I hear from the argument from prophecy is that the prophecies were just really vague, and that you could, looking back, you could really apply it to a number of different occurrences throughout history. And so, because you brought that up as one of the possible criticisms, and that's a common one that I hear. And so, while I do hear some Christian thinkers who do believe that the argument from prophecy is a good argument for God's existence, I'm not really convinced that it's the best, one of the best arguments we could be using. For me, even though I think we have really strong evidence for the miracle claims in the New Testament, I just kind of feel like it's, kind of pointless to try and argue that a miracle happened before you can establish that God exists. And I know that not every Christian will agree with that. Some would say, well, no, we can prove that the miracles happened, and those miracles are actually evidence of God's existence. So there could be something there too. I'm a bit more skeptical that it's possible to convince atheists that miracles have actually happened and use that as an apologetic for God's existence.
No, I would not go the miracle route. I mean, at best, what we can do is defend that miracles are at least possible given an all-powerful God.
Well, right, yeah, that's usually what I say too, because the atheists usually just dismiss miracles out of hand, which is kind of silly, because if you're having a discussion with a Christian, well then if God exists, then certainly it's possible for God to work miracles. So unless you can disprove God's existence, many atheists don't like to do, you have to at least leave the possibility open that miracles are possible.
Yeah. At any rate, that's time to close us out. But, Clinton, you've got a podcast. Go ahead.
I do. Yeah. Okay, so I have a podcast which has been kind of dormant for a while, but we actually have plans to bring it back. It's called Pro-Life Thinking, and you can find it on Blog Talk Radio. So you would just go to blogtalkradio.com/prolifethinking, or you can also find us on iTunes. It's a pro-life podcast, and my two co-hosts are Aaron Brake and Nathan Apodaca. I don't think Aaron's going to be continuing with us because his life has just gotten real busy, but Nathan and I do have plans to continue in the future. We used to kind of split them up between doing episodes with ourselves where we would talk about specific arguments for the pro-life position or arguments for supporting abortion, where we would respond to them and critique them, and then we would also have interviews with pro-life thinkers, pro-life authors who we wanted to talk about their books, sociologists, different kinds of people. And so going forward, it's been probably 4 or 5 months since our last episode, but because it's a little time consuming to do all the editing when we just have our regular episodes, we're actually going to be focusing more on doing interviews moving forward. And so we do have plans to continue that as well. So if anyone is listening and would like to listen to our podcast, we have probably 30 or 40 episodes there that you can listen to. And we also plan on recording some more in the future. In fact, I just booked one person for an interview, and we're going to be booking others as well. So yeah, Pro-Life Thinking is the name of my podcast.
Okay. And our premium podcast for our Patreon subscribers is still chugging along. The most recent topic that we recorded is undesigned coincidence and the Bible. Especially, we're focusing on the undesigned coincidences in the gospel accounts. And what that means is we're looking at a number of different examples of little details dropped in one gospel that resolve questions raised by another gospel. So that's good times. It's been a while since I said this, so I'll say it again. Leave the podcast a 5-star review. That way we'll have more than my mother and Caleb's wife seeing it and subscribing.
Undesigned coincidences is probably one of my favorite arguments, because it's something that I just learned about fairly recently. I heard Tim McGrew talking about it, and I thought it was actually really fascinating, so I want to look more into it myself.
Yeah, the first time I ran across it was from J. Warner Wallace, because he was approaching it from a police detective perspective, and he was talking about how these are the exact kinds of things you look for in eyewitness testimony, and specifically that he looked for in eyewitness testimony when he was interviewing eyewitnesses to a crime.
Yeah.
So these, his approach was really interesting because he was, in fact, a police detective, and he recognized these, without looking into any kind of the literature, he recognized them right off when he was reading the Gospels, because this was his job. But then, I went to a conference and listened to Tim McGrew altogether. Yes, it's very fascinating. I like it. All right, and listeners can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/mentionable1, or on Twitter at mentionables1, because we're inconsistent like that. Our website is thementionables.org, and we have been the Mentionables. Keep on listening and keep on mentioning.